The Sentinel Tower's 47th floor smelled like lemon polish and the faint chemical tang of industrial-strength glass cleaner at 3 in the morning. Elena Vasquez pushed her cleaning cart down the carpeted hallway, her movements economical and practiced, her mind half-occupied with calculations that had nothing to do with the offices she was paid to clean. Rent was due in 5 days. Her daughter's asthma medication needed refilling. The Honda had started making a grinding noise that probably meant brake pads, which meant at least $300 she didn't have. She'd been working the graveyard shift at Sentinel Tower for 8 months now, ever since she'd fled Miami with nothing but 2 suitcases and her 6-year-old daughter asleep in the back seat. The building management company hadn't asked many questions when she'd applied. They never did for positions nobody else wanted, the overnight cleaning jobs that paid minimum wage and required you to be invisible, arriving after everyone left and disappearing before anyone arrived. Elena had become an expert at invisibility over the past few years. She'd learned it during her marriage to Marcus, who had slowly, methodically isolated her from her family and friends, until the world had contracted to the size of their apartment, and his approval had become the air she breathed. She'd perfected it during the 18 months after she'd finally left, when Marcus had tracked her across 3 states, showing up at her jobs, her apartment, anywhere he could find her, his presence a constant threat that she'd never truly be free. San Francisco was supposed to be different. It was 3,000 miles from Miami, in a city large enough to disappear into, in a building so secure that Marcus would never be able to reach her here. The Sentinel Tower housed law firms, investment companies, and the kind of private enterprises that valued discretion and employed security teams that didn't ask questions when they escorted unauthorized visitors to the street. Elena stopped outside Suite 4701, pulling her master keycard from the lanyard around her neck. The brass nameplate beside the door read, Adriano Enterprises, Private Investment Management. She'd been cleaning this office for months now, and she'd learned things about it that probably nobody was supposed to notice. The way certain filing cabinets were always locked, secured with biometric scanners that seemed excessive for an investment firm. The way men in expensive suits arrived at odd hours, their conversations stopping abruptly when she entered to empty wastebaskets. The way the office's owner, a man she'd only glimpsed a handful of times, always from a distance, moved through the space with the kind of authority that suggested violence lived somewhere beneath his civilized surface. Elena swiped her keycard and pushed open the door, wheeling her cart into the reception area. The office was dark except for the emergency lighting that cast everything in a dim, colorless glow. She'd cleaned the conference room first, then the executive offices, then the... She stopped. Something was wrong. Elena had spent 5 years learning to read situations, to notice the small details that warned of larger dangers. It had been necessary for survival when Marcus's moods could shift without warning, when the wrong word or gesture could trigger an explosion of rage that left her nursing bruises and making excuses to her coworkers. She'd developed an almost preternatural sensitivity to wrongness, to the subtle signals that something had shifted in her environment. The door to the main executive office was slightly ajar. Elena always left doors the way she found them. It was one of the unspoken rules of her profession, a way of moving through spaces without leaving evidence of her presence. And she distinctly remembered closing that door last night, had double-checked it because the lock was finicky and sometimes didn't catch properly. Someone had been in the office after she'd left. Someone who hadn't bothered to close the door all the way. Elena stood frozen, her hand still gripping the cart's handle, her heart rate accelerating. She should leave. She should back out of the suite, lock the door behind her, and continue with her rounds as if she'd never noticed anything unusual. Whatever was happening in Adriano Enterprises was none of her business, and getting involved would only draw the kind of attention she'd spent 8 months trying to avoid. But she didn't leave. Instead, moving with careful silence, Elena approached the partially open door. She could see a sliver of the office beyond the edge of an enormous mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, and something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. Wires, thin and dark, running from something attached to the underside of the desk, connecting to a device that had been hidden behind a decorative plant near the window. Elena didn't know much about explosives, but she'd watched enough news coverage, seen enough documentaries, to recognize what she was looking at. Someone had rigged the office. Someone had installed what looked like a bomb, positioned precisely where it would do maximum damage when the office's owner arrived for work in the morning. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone. She should call 911. She should alert building security. She should do something that didn't involve her personally getting any more entangled in whatever dangerous situation she'd just stumbled into. But even as she thought it, Elena knew that calling the authorities would create exactly the kind of attention she couldn't afford. The police would want statements, identification, background information. They'd run her name through their systems and discover the restraining order she'd filed in Miami, the police reports documenting Marcus's stalking behavior, the paper trail that would lead him right to her if he was still looking. She was still standing there, paralyzed by indecision, when she heard the elevator chime in the hallway outside. Someone was coming. Elena moved without thinking, stepping quickly back into the reception area and positioning herself near her cleaning cart. She grabbed a bottle of glass cleaner and a cloth, making herself look busy, trying to steady her breathing as footsteps approached in the corridor. The suite's door opened, and a man entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with predatory grace, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elena made in 3 months. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples, and his face was all sharp angles and shadowed planes. He had a phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and measured as he spoke in what sounded like Italian. Elena recognized him immediately. Dante Adriano, the owner of Adriano Enterprises. She'd seen him before, always from a distance, always in passing. But now he was here, at 3 a.m, and he was walking directly toward the office where someone had planted what she was almost certain was a bomb. She moved before she could stop herself, stepping into his path, her hand raised in a gesture that was half warning, half plea. "Sir, don't go in there yet." Dante stopped mid-stride, his dark eyes focusing on her with sudden intensity. He lowered the phone slightly, though he didn't end the call. "Excuse me?" Elena's mouth was dry, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was breaking every rule of her profession. Stay invisible, don't engage with clients, never interfere with the building's tenants. But she was also possibly saving his life, and that had to count for something. "Your office," she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Don't go in there. Something's wrong." Dante's expression shifted, a sudden sharp focus replacing his initial surprise. He spoke rapidly into the phone, still in Italian, too fast for Elena to follow even if she'd understood the language, and then ended the call. "What did you say?" "There's something in your office, under the desk. I think." Elena stopped, aware of how absurd this was going to sound, how easily he could dismiss her as paranoid or confused. "I think someone planted a bomb." For a long moment, Dante simply stared at her. Elena could see him processing the information, weighing her words against whatever he knew about his own life and the threats that apparently came with it. Then, moving with careful deliberation, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone. "Marco," he said when someone answered, "I need a sweep team at the office now. The cleaning woman says there's a device." A pause. "I don't know, but I'm not taking chances." Another pause, longer this time, and his eyes never left Elena's face. "No, keep everyone back until the team clears it." He ended the call and took a step closer to Elena. She forced herself not to retreat, not to show fear even though every instinct was screaming at her to run. Men with this kind of power, operating in this kind of world, were dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the bombs hidden in their offices. "What's your name?" Dante asked quietly. "Elena. Elena Vasquez. And you work for the building's cleaning service?" "Yes, I've been cleaning your office for 8 months. Dante's gaze intensified, studying her with the kind of focus that made Elena feel exposed, as if he could see past the uniform and the careful anonymity she'd constructed to the frightened woman hiding beneath. 8 months, and I've never seen you. I work overnight, 3 a.m. to noon. You're usually not here. But I'm here now." Dante glanced toward his office door, then back at Elena. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Elena described it. The partially open door, the wires running from beneath the desk, the device hidden behind the plant. Dante listened without interrupting, his expression revealing nothing, though she could see tension in the set of his shoulders, in the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're certain it was a bomb?" he asked when she'd finished. I'm not an expert, but I watch the news. I know what these things look like, more or less. Elena hesitated, then added, I thought about calling 911, but you didn't want the attention. Dante's voice was understanding rather than accusatory. You have reasons for staying invisible. I recognize that impulse. Elena said nothing, unwilling to confirm or deny. The less this man knew about her circumstances, the better. They stood in the reception area, the silence stretching between them, until the elevator chimed again and 4 men emerged into the hallway. They moved with military precision, carrying equipment that Elena recognized from news footage. Bomb detection gear, protective equipment, the tools of professionals who dealt with explosives for a living. Dante spoke to them briefly in Italian, gesturing toward his office. The men nodded and entered, their movements careful and methodical. One of them, older, with gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd seen too much violence, stopped beside Dante and said something too quiet for Elena to hear. Dante's response was equally quiet, but Elena caught the word lie her in Italian and saw the older man's gaze shift to her with sudden interest. Miss Vasquez, Dante said, turning back to her, I'm going to need you to stay here until we've cleared the office. Marco will have questions for you. I should get back to work, Elena said, though she knew it was futile. I have other floors to clean. Your supervisor will be contacted. You won't be penalized for the delay. Dante studied her for another moment. You may have just saved my life. The least I can do is ensure you're compensated for the inconvenience. Compensated, as if discovering a bomb in his office was merely an inconvenience, a minor disruption to her cleaning schedule. Elena wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but the sound stuck in her throat. The sweep team worked for 20 minutes while Elena sat in the reception area, her cleaning cart abandoned, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dante had disappeared into the conference room with Marco, the older man who'd looked at her with such interest. And she could hear the low murmur of their conversation through the closed door, though she couldn't make out words. Finally, one of the sweep team members emerged and nodded to Dante. It's clear now, but you were right to call us. That device was sophisticated. Military-grade components, remote detonation capability. Someone wanted you very dead, Mr. Adriano. Elena felt cold despite the building's climate control. Military-grade. Remote detonation. This wasn't some amateur attempt. This was professional, calculated. And she'd stumbled directly into the middle of it. Dante thanked the sweep team and watched them leave, their equipment packed away, the device presumably secured for disposal or investigation. Then he turned to Elena, who had remained motionless in her chair, trying to process what she'd just heard. Miss Vasquez, he said quietly, I owe you my life. That's not a debt I take lightly. You don't owe me anything, Elena said automatically. I couldn't let you walk in there without warning you. Most people would have. Dante moved closer, crouching slightly so they were at eye level. The gesture made him less intimidating, more human. Most people would have convinced themselves it wasn't their problem, or that they'd misunderstood what they were seeing. But you risked exposing yourself to help a stranger. Elena looked away, uncomfortable with his gratitude, with the way he was looking at her as if she'd done something extraordinary, when she'd simply done what any decent person would do. I should go, finish my shift. You can't. The words were soft but final. Elena's head snapped up, fear spiking through her. What do you mean? Owned firm. Whoever planted that device will know it was discovered. They'll investigate how that happened, and they'll eventually trace it back to you. Which means you're now in danger. Dante's expression was grim. I can't let you leave this building without protection. Marco is already arranging security for you. No, the word came out sharper than Elena had intended. No, I don't need protection. I just want to go home, collect my daughter, and pretend this never happened. You have a daughter, Dante's voice shifted, something almost gentle entering it. How old? 6. She's with a babysitter. I need to get home before she wakes up. Then we'll make sure you get home safely, and that someone is watching your apartment until we determine who's responsible for tonight. Dante stood, his decision clearly made. This isn't negotiable, Miss Vasquez. You saved my life. I won't let anyone hurt you because of it. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could handle herself, that she didn't need help from a man whose world involved bombs and security teams and threats sophisticated enough to warrant military-grade equipment. But she was also intelligent enough to recognize when she was in over her head. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long will this protection last?" "As long as necessary." Dante pulled out a business card, heavy, expensive, with embossed lettering, and held it out to her. "This is my direct number. If anything unusual happens, if you feel unsafe, if you need anything at all, you call me immediately. Understood?" Elena took the card reluctantly. "I don't want to be part of your world." "I know," Dante's voice was understanding. "But unfortunately, you already are. The moment you saw that device and decided to warn me instead of walking away, you became part of this. Now I'm going to make sure you survive the experience." The words should have sounded threatening. Instead, they sounded almost like a promise. The apartment Elena shared with her daughter Sophia was on the second floor of a converted Victorian in the outer Sunset, a neighborhood where fog rolled in thick most mornings, and the sound of the ocean was a constant backdrop. It was small, one bedroom that Elena had given to Sophia, and a living room where Elena slept on a futon. But it was clean and safe and theirs, paid for with the money she earned cleaning offices while the rest of the city slept. Marco had followed her home in a black SUV, maintaining a discreet distance but never letting her out of sight. When Elena had parked her Honda in the building's small lot, Marco had pulled up behind her and rolled down his window. "I'll be here," he'd said simply. "You won't see me, but I'll be watching. Try to maintain your normal routine as much as possible." Normal routine? Elena had almost laughed. Her normal routine didn't include discovering bombs, or accepting protection from men whose lives existed in shadows and violence. But she'd simply nodded and made her way upstairs, letting herself quietly into the apartment where Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor who watched Sophia during Elena's overnight shifts, was dozing on the futon. "Everything okay?" Mrs. Chen had asked, startling awake. "Fine, just a long night." Elena had paid Mrs. Chen, thanked her, and waited until the older woman had shuffled back to her own apartment before checking on Sophia. Her daughter was asleep in the small bedroom, curled around a stuffed elephant that had been her companion since she was 3. Sophia looked peaceful. Her dark hair spread across the pillow, her breathing slow and even despite the asthma that sometimes made nights difficult. Elena stood in the doorway and watched her sleep, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders. Everything she'd done, leaving Marcus, fleeing across the country, building this small, quiet life, had been for Sophia. To give her daughter a childhood free from violence and fear, to create space where Sophia could grow up safe and happy and whole. And now Elena had potentially jeopardized all of that by getting involved in Dante Adriano's dangerous world. She'd pulled out her phone and searched his name, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. The results had made her stomach clench with anxiety. Dante Adriano, alleged head of one of San Francisco's most influential organized crime families. Suspected involvement in everything from construction and real estate to port operations and high-end casinos. Never convicted of anything, always operating on the edge of legality, but mentioned constantly in investigative pieces about the intersection of legitimate business and organized crime. Elena had closed the search and set her phone aside, unable to process the implications. She'd saved the life of a crime boss. And in doing so, she'd made herself visible to the same people who'd planted a bomb in his office. Now, 12 hours later, with Sophia at school and Elena exhausted from a sleepless day spent trying to rest between bouts of anxiety, she sat at her small kitchen table and stared at Dante's business cards. She should call him. She should demand to know what was happening, what kind of danger she and Sophia were in, how long this protection would last. But even thinking about calling made her feel vulnerable in ways she'd worked hard to avoid. Men like Dante Adriano didn't offer help without expecting something in return. She'd learned that lesson with Marcus, who had presented himself as a protector before slowly transforming into a jailer. Her phone buzzed, making her jump. An unknown number. Elena stared at it for 3 rings before answering. "Miss Vasquez?" Dante's voice was unmistakable, even through the phone. "I wanted to check in. Make sure you and your daughter arrived home safely." "We're fine." Elena kept her voice neutral, professional. "Your man Marco has been very discreet." Good. I wanted to let you know that we've identified the individual responsible for last night's incident. He's been addressed. Addressed? Elena didn't want to know what that meant. So the threat is over? You can call off the protection? Not yet. Dante paused. The individual in question was hired by someone else. We're still determining who gave the order. Until we do, I'm not comfortable leaving you exposed. Mr. Adriano. Dante. Please. Dante. The name felt strange in her mouth, too intimate for someone she barely knew. I appreciate your concern, but I have a life. A daughter who goes to school, play dates with friends, doctor's appointments. I can't have security following us everywhere indefinitely. I understand that, which is why I'd like to propose an alternative arrangement. Dante's voice shifted, became more measured. I own a property in Seacliff. Large house, very secure, with space for you and your daughter. I'm late. You could stay there temporarily, until we've resolved the situation. You'd have privacy, and Sophia would be safe. Elena's grip tightened on the phone. You want me to move into your house? Guest house, technically. It's separate from the main residence. You'd have your own space, your own entrance, but you'd be on secured property, which would make protecting you considerably easier. No, the refusal was immediate, instinctive. I'm not moving into your home. I don't know you, and I'm not going to uproot my daughter because of something that isn't even our problem. It became your problem when you saved my life. Dante's voice was gentle but firm. Miss Vasquez, Elena, I understand your hesitation, Mung. You've obviously worked hard to build independence, and accepting help feels like giving that up. But this isn't about control. It's about keeping you and Sophia safe while we eliminate the threat. You can't guarantee our safety anywhere. Elena heard the bitterness in her own voice. I've spent years learning that lesson. The only person I can trust to protect my daughter is myself. Silence stretched across the line. When Dante spoke again, his voice held understanding that surprised her. Someone hurt you. Badly. And you ran to escape them. It wasn't a question. Elena swallowed hard, fighting the urge to end the call. That's none of your business. You're right, Asmat. But it explains why you're so resistant to help, even when it's genuinely offered with no strings attached. Dante paused. I'm not whoever hurt you, Elena. I'm not trying to trap you or control you. I'm simply trying to keep you alive long enough to eliminate a threat that exists because you chose to warn me instead of staying silent. Elena closed her eyes, exhausted and frightened and angry at herself for getting into this situation. I need to think about it. Of course. Take whatever time you need. But Elena? Marco will stay assigned to you regardless. If you won't accept the guest house, at least accept that you're under my protection until this is resolved. After the call ended, Elena sat at her kitchen table and tried to figure out what to do. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to maintain the independence she'd fought so hard to achieve. But she was also pragmatic enough to recognize that the danger was real, that whoever wanted Dante Adriano dead might very well come after her to tie up loose ends. She thought about Sophia, about the life they'd built here, about all the plans she'd made for their future. And she thought about Marcus, about the 5 years she'd spent trapped in a relationship that had slowly consumed her identity, that had taught her to distrust any man who offered help or protection. But Dante Adriano wasn't Marcus. She could hear it in his voice, in the careful way he'd acknowledged her fears without dismissing them, in his willingness to give her space to decide rather than demanding immediate compliance. Maybe that was the most dangerous thing about him, not his connections to organized crime or the violence that apparently followed him, but the way he seemed to understand her, to see past the careful walls she'd built and recognize the wounded person hiding behind them. Elena picked up Dante's business card again, running her thumb over the embossed lettering. She had until 3 a.m., when her shift started, to decide. To choose between the precarious independence she'd built and the protection offered by a man whose world she didn't understand and probably shouldn't trust. She thought she already knew what her choice would be. She just wasn't sure she was brave enough to admit it yet.